Thank you for joining the first webinar in our two-part series on Israel and Palestine. Today, our panel aims to examine the strategic and diplomatic consequences of October 7th and its aftermath, assess how events have shifted domestic politics, regional alignments, and international engagement, explore what pathways remain for de-escalation, diplomacy, and long-term stability. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce a dear friend and our moderator for today's important conversation, Dr. Mike Yaffe, a seasoned diplomat, public policy practitioner, and teacher dedicated to advancing global security and civic engagement. Most recently, Dr. Yaffe held senior roles at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he served as vice president for the Gandhi King Global Academy, Civic Engagement and Scholarship Unit, and Center on the Middle East and Africa. During a career at the U.S. Department of State, Dr. Yaffe served as senior advisor to three successive special envoys for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and as a foreign affairs officer focusing on arms control, nonproliferation, and regional security in the Middle East. Mike, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mandy. And congratulations to you and the team and at IMEO for organizing this event.
Thank you.
And I'm very glad to participate in it. And I welcome everybody who's joining us today for this discussion with three distinguished panelists who will give us insights into what is happening in the region, what is happening in particular countries on this somber anniversary. So yesterday, October 7th, marked the 2-year anniversary of the attack by Hamas on Israel. It was followed by a devastating war. It is the 5th war that has happened between Israel and Hamas in the last dozen years. And it is a time then we'd like to take for reflection to understand how the region has changed over the last 2 years and to get a perspective from three insightful individuals about how they see it has changed, how the region has changed, how Israel has changed, how the Palestinians have changed, and how the global context has also changed as a result of the conflict. This session was organized initially before September 29th, that is to say, before President Trump announced his framework for a ceasefire plan, which is currently being negotiated, as we understand it, in Cairo amongst the parties to see if it can be put into effect and reach some form of agreement. But even so, there are a lot of details that will come out about that over the next few days. And I don't think it should be our purpose here to basically get into the details of the plan itself, as so many other outlets are covering that. I think this is a chance for us to reflect on what has happened, as I said, to the region, to the parties, to the nature of this conflict, to understand whether or not this, where we are now, is an inflection point, or if it's too unclear to understand if it is an inflection point, and where we think the region may go from here, and if it's possible that there could be a peace process that is initiated between the Israelis and Palestinians, and what that might look like in itself. So with that, let me introduce our three panelists, and I'm very happy to welcome the panelists and to engage with them once again. So let me begin by introducing Ambassador Barbara Leaf. Ambassador Leaf most recently served in the State Department as the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. She served in this capacity from 2022 to 2025. And in that capacity, she oversaw the 21 posts that make up the Near Eastern region, a budget of $7.5 million, and policies particularly focusing on areas going all the way from Morocco to Yemen. She had been appointed in January 2021 as the Senior Director for the Middle East and North Africa and Special Assistant to President Biden on the National Security Council. She has served many different capacities, both in the State Department and has also left the State Department for various stints, including with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where she directed the Arab Politics Program from 2018 to 2021. Ambassador Leaf has also served as the U.S. Ambassador to the UAE from 2014, to 2018. And previously, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Affairs and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq. And Barbara has also held various other postings in her long career, including in Basra and Rome as the Director of Iranian Affairs, in Paris and Cairo, and various other places. She has been awarded many different awards, including the Distinguished Honor Award by Secretary Blinken, and she has received numerous superior and meritorious honor awards during her career. Ambassador Leaf is currently the Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute and has joined Arnold and Portner, where she serves as a senior international policy advisor within that law firm. So, Ambassador Leaf, we very much welcome you. Let me introduce the other panelists, and then we're going to turn it over to each of you for some brief opening remarks. So now let me introduce Dr. Shira Ephraim. Shira is Rand Corporation Distinguished Chair for Israel Policy. She is a leading expert on Israeli and Middle Eastern affairs and brings over 2 decades of experience in policy and analysis and research, and had previously led Rand's Israel program from 2016 to 2022. Most recently, Shira served as the Director of Research and the Glazer Foundation Senior Fellow at the Israel Policy Forum. She has also advised Israel's Ministry of Defense and its National Security Council, and co-chairs subgroups on regional cooperation for Israel's President's Climate Forum. She also has held roles at the Center for American Progress, the Middle East Institute, the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and has been a consultant to the UN country team in Jerusalem. Now let me turn to the third panelist and welcome Dr. Hetam Kayali. Hetam is the founder and CEO of Palala, a Palestinian company that specializes in the production of active ingredients for pharmaceuticals and food supplements. Paele, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. You can correct me, Hetam, was the first company established at the Jericho Agro-Industrial Park, also dubbed the Corridor for Peace. The company follows pharmaceutical standards and employing state-of-the-art technology. Before founding this company, Hetam was the director of Al Karama, a national empowerment fund. He also was the former director of Prosper Palestine, an international initiative that worked to promote Palestinian economy. He holds a master's degree in international studies and a PhD in conflict management from Coventry University. So welcome, Hetam. So I now want to turn to each of you to provide some brief opening remarks, and then we'll have a brief panel discussion before we open it up to the Q&A from the audience. Let me also take a moment here to repeat what Manny said. We welcome your questions. We suggest that you start typing them as they come up in the discussions, and so that when we get to the period when we turn to Q&A, that they'll be all teamed up and ready for us. So with that, let me turn it over to Barbara. Good to see you again, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Mike. And it's certainly a pleasure to be on this panel with Shira and Hetam. So let me start by saying that the region has been immutably altered by the events of October 7th and the war thereafter. Israeli society unquestionably has been deeply traumatized in a way that has shattered any sense of security as well as faith in its government and military. The Palestinians of Gaza have had visited upon them an equally shattering sense of trauma, but one built on a far larger scale of death, injury, and destruction, of lives, of social institutions, of the very fabric of society itself. The Palestinians of the West Bank and the diaspora have relived their own long-standing sense of loss and trauma and lack of agency over their lives through the experience of Gazans. And the peoples of the wider region have lived with an unrelenting stream of footage from Gaza, with the consequent anger that has lashed at their governments. And with that has come the ever-rising threat of radicalization of young people who, through the Gaza war, have become abruptly reacquainted with the unresolved issue of the Palestinians. And in the US, I will just say, we saw over the course of months and then the full 15 months of my service, first unrest, protests on major university campuses, and now 2 years later, as the polling indicates on both the left and the right side of the political spectrum in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, serious inroads of longstanding U.S. support, not only on both sides of the spectrum, but most pronounced in the across generational lines. But I would say it's critical to look at Gaza against the backdrop of a radically altered landscape. Lebanon, where Hezbollah is shattered, albeit not destroyed. Syria, where a new fragile regime is taking the country and its traumatized population through an agonizing political transition and economic rebuilding. Iran, where a 12-day military campaign waged by Israel and joined by the US at the end to render the denouement of crippling strikes on the nuclear and missile programs and evisceration of the ranks of the IRGC and military leaderships. Thus, the threats that Israel faced on the morning of October 7th and the 7 fronts on which the Israeli military flew night after night, they have been substantially altered, not removed, but significantly degraded in every direction. This altered threat landscape stands in jarring contrast to the outlook that forms the Israeli government's outlook and the new military doctrine that has moved the IDF from a deter, defend posture to preempt, destroy. Thus, the regular tempo of military strikes in Lebanon and Syria continue, notwithstanding the much weakened state of Hezbollah on the one hand, and the clear signaling by both Damascus and Washington that both desire an end to Israeli military action in Syria and a set of arrangements to take place to de-escalate and demilitarize. As the Gaza conflict is ground on, Israel's international isolation has dramatically increased. Within the region, Israel's longest relations with Arab partners are badly strained, and public scrutiny of and pressure on relations with the Abraham Accord partners has increased in parallel. At a moment of supreme international pressure on Israel, culminating in European and other states unilaterally recognizing a Palestinian state, the Trump administration's abrupt and big diplomatic moves to drive the conflict to an end have opened a door for the first time in 2 years, not just for the end of the conflict. Conceivably, the door is open now for a post-conflict reordering of Palestinian affairs, with a corollary potentially positive impact on the region, albeit via a long, complex, messy, and unquestionably difficult such process. The potential for spoilers, as always, remains vast. And the burden of ensuring that things don't end at phase 1 with the exchange of hostages and detainees and prisoners will remain heavily on the shoulders of the Trump administration and on President Trump himself. The Gang of Eight, as I think of the 8 countries which met with the president and which formed the Arab and Muslim country backstopping for this project, will need to press the administration constantly to keep up the pressure and will need to keep themselves well aligned along a pretty complex set of decisions about governance and security. That will be no small thing in and of itself, considering that Turkey and Egypt and UAE and Qatar are in that mix. So I have never been accused of being giddily optimistic about the state of things in the region, and least of all in the past 2 years. But I think measured optimism is in order, finally. The changes wrought in Lebanon, Syria, and to Iran's arsenal of non-conventional and conventional weapons that Tehran has used to such destabilizing effect on the region for decades are profound. They provided a window of opportunity for political transitions, security, and stability in a part of the region, the Levant, that has been most insecure, most unstable, and has acted as the playing field of external actors that rob the Lebanese and Syrians of agency over their own affairs. If coupled with successful transitions in Lebanon and Syria, Gaza can well and truly be stabilized and rebuilt with an oversight structure that will give Palestinians, albeit small, increasing agency over their own affairs. and thus the dividends for the region would be enormous. The legitimacy of that undertaking in Gaza, however, will depend squarely on the degree to which Palestinians, above all from Gaza, are integrated fully in both governance and security. Finally, the degree to which a political horizon for the Palestinians, however faintly sketched in these 20 points, the degree to which that is visible for the first time in years and made operational, that will provide the ballast for the kind of political and economic integration of the region that would be truly transformational. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Barbara, and raised lots of good points and lots of questions as well. So, but let me turn now to Shira and her perspective on what has happened in the last 2 years, and particularly on what has happened within Israel as a result of the October 7th attacks. Shira?
Hi, Mike. Good to be here with you and with Barbara and with Haitham and of course Manny and the team. Um, so I just think it is worth it because we are talking a day after October 7th that, we're coming at 2 years. And I think for many of us who on that day, it was very clear to us that there will be a war and it will be a brutal war. And it was, I can say personally that I had spoken that day with some, not that day, but I think October 9th, with some Israeli senior defense officials. And I said, are we even considering the option of a deal for all hostages, for all Palestinian prisoners, and then thinking, mourning, and thinking, what can we do, and deciding whether we're launching a war or not. And some of those people said that this option was brought up but not really considered. It was very clear the state of mind on that day. I do think that it was hard to imagine that this will drag on for so long, for 2 years, right? With immense tolls on both societies. The war obviously started with the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, but it continued with the biggest killing and displacement of Palestinians since the Nakba of 48. When we're talking about the Israelis, we're talking about over 2,000 Israelis that were killed in this war over the multiple fronts that Barbara discussed. We're talking about unprecedented rates of injury, PTSD levels, which I think Americans know very well from the times of Iraq and Afghanistan. I've heard statistics that I can't fathom this number, that 1 million Israelis suffer from post-trauma stress disorder. This makes a tenth of the population. I don't know how they measure it, but either way, this is really a number that a country the size of Israel can't even cope with. Obviously, and I'm sure Haitham will speak about this, we're talking about reports of close to over 67,000 Palestinians who were killed in Gaza, according to the Hamas-controlled health ministry. But there are also thousands more were killed right in the West Bank and in Lebanon and Iran and Syria and Yemen. I mean, from an Israeli perspective, there were attacks on 7 fronts. When we talk about the hostages, and I do think it's important to mention it, we're talking about 251, I think, hostages that Hamas captured, 148 returned alive. There are 48 hostages in Gaza today, 20 of them believed to be still alive. Now, I'm saying this because I want to bring it to current day. Even if President Trump's initiative plan succeeds, and all indications are that we can be optimistic for the first time in 2 years, I think the human tragedy and the geopolitical changes that the region has gone through will be felt for generations. And it's too early to say if they're going to be positive or negative. I'll just say a few maybe big observations, and we can deepen into. So obviously, I don't think this needs to be a zero-sum game, right? But in Israel, it's perceived as zero-sum game when support for Palestinian rights and the idea of a Palestinian state and Palestinian right for self-determination is deemed in Israel as anti-Israel. And clearly, the support for Palestinians has risen substantially over the last 2 years. This support, however, is juxtaposed against the Palestinian situation on the ground, which I'm sure Haitham will speak about, right? Both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And I think in practice, the Palestinians have never been is far from fulfilling the rights and dignity in ways that they deserve. But this is one big observation. Israel, that since October 7, and Barbara, you may have reservations about this, but in the Israeli mindset, Israel has turned into the de facto security guarantor of the region. Israeli strikes across the region against what experts have advised, right, including myself. I thought some of the things are crazy, but Israel changed the region in ways that could make it safer, um, and but Israel's international and regional stance couldn't have been at worst situation. I Israelis say that over the last, I'm not talking about the Yom Kippur and 67 war, but over the last decades, Israelis, some Israelis dismiss it and say, well, no one likes the Israelis during wartime, but after the war, we bounce back. I think this is an assumption that we see today. I don't think this assumption is valid. I am out of the country now. I travel a lot. I have never, ever seen so many anti-Israel graffiti in places that are friendly to Israelis. And this will take time for Israel, it will take time to recover from this from this war. I think another observation here that has changed Israel, and maybe we don't know if it's changed it for good. Some of and Barbara probably having worked across the region with the US being much more disciplined, right? In Israel, everyone has an opinion, and Israel was known as having a professional rank that would challenge the political rank. Famously, throughout the years, right? There'd be like people in uniform saying, no, we can't do this, we shouldn't do this. Something changed. We found ourselves in a different balance of power against the advice of the Israeli defense establishment time after time about going into Rafah, which Barbara knows because she was in the administration back then, maybe because of a substance reason or just for being afraid of the implications of what will happen with the Biden administration. Striking Hezbollah and killing Nasrallah. I mean, the reference, the threat scenario, we had thought that Israel, the Tel Aviv skyline would be gone, and definitely with a preemptive strike on Iran, Syria, of course, and now by the invasion to Gaza City, this operation where the IDF said it's not going to deliver Hamas. Hamas is not going to surrender, and given Israel's diplomatic stance on the humanitarian situation, we can't do it, and the cabinet decided to do it no matter what. And what they're saying is like every time you tell us not to do something and we do it, and it turns out to go very well. I have reservation on whether it goes well or not, but this is something that changed in Israel, and it might it might change back when there's a new IDF leadership that is not guilt-stricken by the October 7 attacks, when you have a different political rank in Israel. But this is something I think for people outside of Israel that just assume all Israelis support the policies of this government. So all polling shows that over 70% of the Israelis do not support the government's policies, that they won this war over a long time ago, with prioritization of the return of the hostages. The government obviously has proven again and again that's in a different place, and its priorities are different. And I'll just tell you this as an example. Yesterday was the 2-year, right, obviously the anniversary, and we haven't heard from an official government person anything about October 7th. Anything. There are different excuses. It's not the Hebrew date. It's not this, but there was nothing about it. So while you and the rest of the world are mourning this moment, the Israeli government has said nothing. Where are we going? Israelis were not lovers of risk. They were very risk averse before October 7. I think October 7 made them even more risk averse, and Israel sees risks everywhere and anywhere and fails to see opportunities, even though these opportunities exist, and they exist everywhere. And this is why, whether I was opposed to some of these actions, we see some really impressive military achievements across the regions, but they're not being translated into those diplomatic, strategic victories that you can have in Lebanon and in Syria, and who knows, maybe in Iran and in other places. And because also Israel has messed up so badly judging its adversaries' intentions, they're now preemptively striking at adversaries' capabilities, right? Because they can't trust assessing their intentions again. But here's where we conflate between is Egypt adversary, is Jordan, where do we take this in terms of the region? Maybe I'll just say I do think you asked about if this is an inflection point. I do think we're at an inflection point because President Trump did not bring something that was not on the table before. The contours of his 20 points are all familiar to us and have been familiar to us from the many plans think tanks have written and the Biden administration presented. And it's fine because if we all play the same melody, it must mean that it has something, right? This is the principles. The way he's doing it is different. And it looks like he's adamant about pressuring Israel to accepting a deal and bringing Qatar and Turkey to pressure Hamas to accept an agreement. And I'm optimistic that we're gonna see some good news coming from Sharm in the next few days. And this is all the good part. The bad part, or not the bad part, but where it's challenging is that while we can see the first stage, right? It's the hostages return, prisoners are being released, the IDF withdraws to a certain line, humanitarian trucks come in, and then what? How do we move to the second stage? And I think this is a collective failure here because we all said we need to plan for the day after, but we wrote papers, but no one did the work. So you know what's going to happen, and I'm still fully supportive of this, but the day that the IDF withdraws, Hamas is going to, reinstitute law and order and start taking care of rubble removal. There's no one else that in the immediate can go in and build any we don't have this transitional body is not ready. The Palestinian forces in big numbers are not ready to go in, and we don't even have this institutional framework. And for Israel, this is more of not a transactional, but a very functional deal. Yes, we're getting the hostages, but we're staying in Gaza, victory declared. If we all think, and I definitely think this is an opportunity to move beyond that and turn Gaza to have Gaza a leadership and a government that dignifies its people with services and doesn't pose a threat to its neighbors, we would have to go to the next stages, and they're going to be complicated and ugly and involve disarmament. What does it even mean? And for that, we will need President Trump and his partners to persevere in ways that I hope he's aware and is willing to put the hard work, because otherwise we will be faced with a situation that will continue to make life unsustainable for the Gazans and for Israelis on the border. I'll stop with that.
Okay, thanks, Sherry. You covered a lot of landscape there, including the domestic politics in Israel, the civil-military relations, as well as the points related to the plan that are concerning, and how prepared are we to implement an agreement and going forward. So we'll come back to that, I think. Hitam, let me turn to you and for the perspective on the Palestinians and how do you see going forward? There were a lot of interesting things that came out of the Trump plan, which recognized the Palestinian Authority having a role. It did not mention about Hamas having to leave Gaza, per se. There's a lot of interesting things that we just don't have a lot of details on. But more significantly, there's been a lot of destruction. I noted that when this war first started, in looking at the past 4 wars, there was a ratio between Palestinian and Israelis' deaths in each of those wars on average. And I have to say, even this 5th war actually fits that ratio of the number of Israelis to Palestinians death. However, so many other things are unprecedented in terms of the destruction of housing, infrastructure, buildings, and as well as all the mental impacts that will have on the people living in Gaza. But it still raises all sorts of other questions about the future of the two-state solution and the role of the PA. So there's a lot of landscape there for you to cover as well. So over to you for your insights.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. An absolute pleasure being with Barbara and Shira, and thank you to Manny and Salome for arranging this. I mean, Shira mentioned the expectation that I would be speaking about the suffering, but I mean, obviously, I think it's quite understood what's been happening and how horrific it is. I don't think we have full comprehension of everything that's been going on, and not just in Gaza, the West Bank, also what's happening in terms of settler violence and trying to attack every prospect of hope for a peaceful resolution. And this really has been the last couple decades. It's been a struggle between the forces that favor a violent approach or an approach through violence, or the forces that basically want diplomacy and peace building and so on. And I think I mean, if we go back a bit, I always mention the Gaza disengagement as one of the major events that happened that could have happened in a different way. So it's a good event, but it just could have happened in a very different way, with different description, narrative, and so on. If you recall, at the time, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon kept on insisting that this was unilateral withdrawal. Okay. And he was withdrawing either way, and could have pretended that this was a result of negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, with Mahmoud Abbas, and to show what negotiations can basically bear. Instead, the insistence was that this is unilateral. And as a result, Hamas stood up and said, you know, we kicked them out. This is the result of our armed resistance and so on. 1 year later, the elections happen and Hamas is popular. So I think that in a way, there's been the events didn't obviously start on October 7th, and we go back decades and decades. But thinking about Gaza, I think the 2005 disengagement was something that really emboldened the wrong party. And at the end, if you speak with most Israelis, they will say their main argument against the two-state solution is that we gave them Gaza. Look what we got, rockets. What if we give them the West Bank? So it was one of the biggest things against the two-state solution. But I want to agree with both Barbara and Shira on the measured optimism. I think it's really interesting looking at the difference between February, Trump's Riviera proposal, and October's this last 20-point plan, and it really goes along coercion theory, which rests on on one premise, which is you alter your opponent's expectations of the future by creating the credible possibility of an outcome they fear most. And the outcome that we Palestinians fear most is basically going back to 1948, expulsion, removal. So, and the fear doesn't have to be acted upon, it just has to be believable. So when the opponent perceives that it's real, you become attracted to compromise. And so the fear stage was set in February 2025, when he spoke about the Riviera of the Middle East, and Gazans could be settled elsewhere voluntarily, but obviously when the conditions that they're living in, it's not really voluntarily. But again, it really triggered deep collective trauma, and basically the worst case scenario we could think of in Palestinian psychology and identity. And then came the 20-point plan recently, where it says things like no one will be forced to leave Gaza. We will encourage people to stay and offer them the opportunity to build a better Gaza. So it offers relief after exposure to deep fear. And when comparing it to the first to February, the new plan appears far more moderate, compassionate, and palatable. So again, the shift in language from psychological shock to reassurance that no, people are there, makes the whole thing a lot more palatable. Now, in terms of shifts in positions internally. I mean, it's far too soon. I think we're still both sides are wounded. I can speak for on behalf of the Palestinian side, obviously very, very wounded and really attending to the wound at the moment. I think both sides are like two parties taking swings at each other, and we do need a third mediator or party to kind of set both sides apart and try to put things on the right path. But it's hard to be thinking objectively. I think that what again the events did is really trigger the need for a solution, not necessarily understanding what exactly the solution is, but the need for a solution and for things to change. I mean, we know as a Palestinian, I must say that it is the two-state solution. We want a Palestinian state. I know the Israeli argument of trust and so on and everything, but our argument is, okay, we do want a state, but looking at facts on the ground, the settlements, the E1, everything. I mean, when we talk about the threat of annexation as a policy being announced, yes, it's an announcement, but on the ground, I mean, things are really, really accelerating in a way that make it really impossible to comprehend how a Palestinian state can be established on the West Bank. But again, it's really I haven't seen people change political parties. I haven't seen people change the approach they think about over the last 2 years. Unfortunately, I think if anything, people at this stage are still at a point where they're probably even more entrenched in whatever positions they have. But again, it's because of them being so emotional and really it's hard to be again objective when you're in the middle of the wound and not even neither side have grieved yet. But again, it's a matter of approach. Let's put aside names, leaders, political parties, and so on. It's two approaches: either diplomatic, peaceful resolution, or resolution by force. Unfortunately, the last decades have, you've seen real alignment and partnership, really, to some extent, between those favoring resolution by force, but we haven't seen enough of the other ones favoring diplomatic, peaceful resolution, and so on. But we have to be realistic in what is possible at the moment. I think the idea of a solution happening overnight or being forced is just impossible. There are certain assumptions that we have to take into account, such as there is no trust whatsoever between the two sides. And positions are a result of decades of traumatic events that are concentrated over the past 2 years. So it will take time to rebuild the same conditions that existed before Oslo. And I think that's what's meant when we talk about a credible, irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. It not happening overnight doesn't mean that the conditions don't have to change in a way that can actually foster better relations. I wish that ending the war in Gaza, and I hope that it does end very, very soon, and we'll hear good news after this call or meeting. But I did wish that the ending of the Gaza war would also be part of a wider package, which is a pathway again towards a Palestinian state and regional integration and so on. So for now, I think that's my contribution.
Thank you, Tim. Very, very insightful. So we have gotten several questions in that are very specific, and I'm going to turn to them briefly since we want to use the remaining time fruitfully here. But I wanted to begin with you, Barbara, and ask you a question about how you perceive how the U.S. is being perceived in the region. That is to say that I've always felt that, when we talk about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, it's really three major parties to that conflict: Israel, the Palestinians, and the United States. And now President Trump has now certainly come out with an initiative here. And I wonder if you have a perspective of how people in the region are viewing the U.S. Is it able to deliver on an agreement? How it views the U.S. and its role in changing in the Middle East, and what kind of role that is. So let me first turn to you, Barbara, and then I'm going to ask specific questions for Shira and Hatam after that.
So I think, in the period of time that I was in office, both in the White House and in the State Department for the Biden administration, and especially once you had the attacks of October 7th, the beginning of that Israeli response, the war, there's no question there was a complete cratering of support or positive feelings whatsoever about the U.S. as week after week, the singular request, public and private, from all of our partners in the region was just get the war to stop, get Israel to stop. And so we were part and parcel, of what both the public and the government saw as a complete failure of U.S. leadership. And that's not something you can successfully argue back against when the war is raging as it was. Now, I think there is perhaps an over optimistic assumption of what one president can do, and the president in this case is President Trump. I'm not surprised that there is over optimistic or maybe even exaggerated assumptions of his powers. I say that as somebody who had 35 plus years of watching, especially at times when the U.S. was the only superpower, the limits of U.S. ability to shape, influence, or control the actions of the friendliest government. So Trump has been provoked, I would argue, to this point, both because of his own impatience for the war to end so that he could get on to what he really wants to do, which is foster normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel and a wider community of states. But also because of the what we didn't talk about, the September 9th Israeli strike on attempting to go after Hamas leadership in Doha. So whatever the reasons, the fact is he's been roused to anger and roused to action. I think going back to this issue of outsized expectations, and what I said earlier about the long, winding, messy, difficult road, that's where I become much less optimistic about my own government's staying power, because you've got to put a battery of people against this, not just Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, whatever their gifts or their access to the president. You've got to have staying power in this quest. And that's just to get to the second phase, let alone to something longer. And that's why I think the Gang of Eight being involved in this is a very good thing. And it was, much as we talked to our, especially those 5 Arab partners, endlessly about this, we could not get them to the point of what I think just the sheer terribleness of events have brought them to do, the desperation, which is to put their hands around a plan that is not as detailed as a true plan should be, but is something. We could not get them there, although we had some very fruitful, detailed discussions with the UAE in particular. But there was a felt imperative to just get the war to stop, and then we'll talk about the post-conflict setting. And it was always my conviction from the very first that if you could not talk about what you wanted on the other side of the conflict, you would never get the conflict to end. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you for that. I also would be curious to know how you see how the region has changed as a result of the recent phenomenon, particularly what Shira talked about, with the Israelis operating on 7 fronts, Israel having attacked various countries throughout the region.
A very quick
how
word
that
on
has
that. I
changed.
would just say the word hegemon is used constantly now by the friendliest of Gulf partners about Israel. And that's, I agree with Shira's point that the Israeli leadership, military and civilian, has not absorb that reality. And I know from having talked to a set of very senior performers on September 9th during a conference I was in, that they too, although they weren't privy to the decision, they said, well, isn't it the case though that what may be public criticism will be actually private support? And I said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And this is, to strike a Gulf country is like assaulting them all.
Yeah, so it's an interesting moment of integration, if you will, within the region. So, okay, so we have received several questions, and I'm going to try to bundle them together as I can here. I'm going to first turn to questions that are, I think, directed more towards you, Shira. So let me see. So we have from Mohammed Abdul Hadi from Saudi Arabia. He asks these questions. How are Israel's relationship with regional partners, particularly those involved in normalization, being impacted? How do Israelis view the role of the United States and other international actors at this stage? Is there any space for regional cooperation on humanitarian or reconstruction efforts? And then from Victoria Jones from the United Kingdom, we have how do Israelis today perceive the country's security situation and its leadership handling of the war? What internal debates are shaping Israel's political direction and policies towards Gaza and the West Bank? How has international criticisms affected domestic thinking and policy? So some of those questions I think do hit upon things that you also hit in the first time, Shira, but I'll turn it over to you to see how you want to answer those questions.
Okay, so on the regional ties, I think I agree with Barbara. We've seen the UAE, fundamentally, if we're talking about the Abraham Accords, right, we talk about the UAE and Morocco and Bahrain, and those countries are not all alike. There were covert ties, right, secret ties going back to the 80s, and a lot of the bedrock of those ties were, defense ties and arms sales, and those things continue. That's not the issue. But what happened with the Abraham Accords was something that the Israelis, for the first time, felt that they're integrated into the region, and the UAE, the country was the leader of the Abraham Accords, really made an effort. It was the only country, in fact, to never cancel flights to Israel, which I'm going to tell you, it was very difficult to fly out of Israel for a long time. Haitham knows also as a Jerusalemite, and very difficult to fly. And the UAE made a point of sticking by it. The continuation of the war created divides even in this relationship. Until this day, the UAE leadership has not met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The leadership of the UAE is meeting the opposition leaders, but not the government. Israelis still, go to Dubai and Abu Dhabi and are invited to conferences as there are deals. But like any other in any other area, right? There's been a cooling off effect as a result of the war in Gaza. It's both by the private sector and the government. And I think that what happened with the Israeli strike on Doha, which really trends that we've seen for a long time, this was sort of someone from the UAE told me this is undone. Right? There's when we talk about overreach, and there's overreach, and this was an overreach that we didn't expect. First of all, because it's an attack on the GCC as seen as a GCC as a whole, but also because it jeopardizes their security needs. It doesn't have to do with the fact that whether they like the Qataris or they don't like the Qataris, right? I think Barbara and I were at the same conference and hearing about a strike then, a lot of Israelis saying, oh yeah, but of course we should have done it, and no one cares about Hamas, no one's care. Well, you know what? This is not the issue. So the challenge that I see is with the Abraham Accord countries, but also more with the original normalizers, right? With Egypt, ties have not been so tense since the 67. I mean, since Yom Kippur War. We've seen the Egyptians amass forces on the Sinai side. They've been doing it for a long time. There's a mechanism for addressing violations of the peace treaty that are being handled pretty well. But Egyptians say now that because of the Doha strike, they think that they might be next. it might be an excuse that Egypt uses, but it's still a valid excuse in their own mind, with no political diplomatic ties between Israel and Egypt. There's the defense ties, but not nothing else. And then Jordan as well. And this is really a shame, because when you ask if there's room for regional cooperation across the board, right, on climate change and water security and food security, on humanitarian stuff, on reconstruction, not just for Gaza. I mean, Lebanon needs reconstruction, Syria needs reconstruction. This whole talk about IMEC, which can be used as a framework for reconstruction. So it makes all sense. And I mean, the region is going to be involved in humanitarian response, because according to President Trump's plan, a lot of the plans that I was involved in also drafting, there's an assumption that the Gulf countries will pay for all this. So this is one thing. I think when there was a question about sort of international pressure, when you say Israelis, it's hard to ask about what Israelis see in the U.S. President Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, I think he sees the international community as basically stretching between 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and Capitol Hill, and put all the bets on President Trump. Other Israelis understand that there's going to be a different administration, might be a different Congress, that think there are waves of change in the United States as well. And this is too dangerous. And not to mention, you're talking from England, I think. I mean, if we look at the EU, I know UK is not in the EU, but we look at the EU as a whole, this is Israel's number one investment partner, trade partner. I mean, Israel without the European Union and with Europe at all will be a very different country. And so how do you recover from that? How do you restore ties and confidence and see the value of partnership, which I think there is value in partnership and security relationship with Israel, and Israel has been and can be a very constructive partner, which the US and Europe and the Arab partners will appreciate, but it has to be managed a little bit differently. And the first step to it is ending this war.
Great, thank you. So we have a bunch of new questions coming in, but I'm going to turn it over to Haytham first here for the questions regarding the Palestinians. So we have a question here with regard to how the Palestinians view the internal political landscape, particularly the divide between the West Bank and Gaza, and what are the prospects for renewed political unity or reform. And then from Nancy Smith from the United States, we have, how have global reactions to the war affected Palestinian trust in international institutions, including the UN and major powers? Also, who is emerging to become the leader of the future Palestinian state? So those are two big questions for you, Haytham.
Yeah, quite big. I'll try my best. Look, one of the things about this for the past 2 years is that I think we have to make peace within our own society, build peace among the different actors and players, and really reflect on the mistakes that we've made over the last 2 decades. And the two questions kind of, I mean, when you talk about building state institutions, which I think we were beginning to when Prime Minister Salam Fayyad was in office. The foundations were really put back then. But even, I mean, there was no, I mean, politically we weren't where we wanted to be, but it was again a lot better than it is now. And for a Palestinian Authority to, or any government to operate under the conditions currently, it's going to be very, very difficult. And normally you would have people in office run and win elections based on what they are delivering and able to deliver on a political level when it comes to, again, us Palestinians versus Israel. But Mahmoud Abbas One thing he's been able to do is really hold on to the approach of diplomacy and nonviolence and still remain in office, which is an enormous task, given again there's been very little that he's been able to deliver when it comes to politics and negotiations and everything. And yet again the national kind of approach is still following the Oslo peace process. Now, it's really tied with, again, what kind of space and time we're able to kind of carve out over the coming years to allow for state institutions to be built properly, for education to be built properly, for the economy. I mean, right now, it's unbelievable seeing how creative this current Israeli government is in suffocating the Palestinian economy and constantly keeping it really on the verge of collapse. I mean, sometimes you'd wish that it would just collapse so we'd know how to kind of rebuild it all over again, but constantly on the verge. And one example is the Israeli Central Bank not accepting to take the shekel from Palestinian banks, and as a result, you have billions of shekels in Palestinian banks, which aren't worth the money that they're printed on, effectively, essentially. And even if for, I mean, just to give you an example, as a business, we're not allowed to deposit more than 100,000 shekels per month into the banking system. As an individual, you're not allowed to deposit more than 5,000 shekels per month into the banking system because the banks just can't take any more shekel. And every branch has a limit of 70,000 shekels in total every day to accept from anyone. So these are things that, again, you're talking about an entire banking system that is always on the verge of collapse. I think just a month ago or so, the Israeli central bank accepted 4 billion shekels back. And they only do that to prevent the banking system from collapsing. Again, just keeping it barely alive. So if these conditions continue, what do you expect out of any government, whether regardless of the names, regardless of political party, and so on? Again, I do hope that what we've been through really allows us as society to reflect on many things and really be more objective and less emotional about things moving forward. Trust in international organizations like the UN. Very little, very little trust, unfortunately. I mean, if things were happening democratically at the UN and decisions were based on democratic values, one vote, one person, one vote, obviously things will be very different. The UN is not a democratic institution when it comes to things being decided or executed. But again, I have to say that for the past decades, we've really been following slogans. And I think that much of the world, even in support, I mean, we see lots of protests around the world and so on in favor of better conditions in Palestine against obviously the horrendous things happening right now. How can we transition that kind of support into something that feeds into the building of the state, the economy, integration with the rest of the world, connectivity? It's so important for Palestinians to understand the world and for the world to understand Palestinians. And unfortunately, for the last couple of decades, there has been lots of isolation. And I think I am of the last of the generation that remembers how it was before the Oslo peace process, and even during Oslo, up until the second Intifada, where there was no such thing as checkpoints, there was no such thing as the wall. You would see ultra-Orthodox Jews shopping in the city centers of Nablus, of Ramallah, of Hebron. You'd see cars with Gaza number plates on the beach in Tel Aviv. And it was people interacted, and that's what kept the lid on violence ever escalating to what it did after the separation happened. And it's sad that I am able to imagine that because I experienced it. But for younger generations, they can't even comprehend or imagine that that is something that is possible. We know that it's possible, but again, it's about connectivity and really integrating the world with Palestine, kind of integrating Palestine into the world.
Great. If I could do a quick follow-up, which would be that, and a little bit to Nancy Smith's question, which was in light of the recent decision by the UK, France, and others to recognize the Palestinian state for the first time, how does that impact the Palestinian perspective?
I think it's very, very important because it just shows that there is somewhere we can get through peaceful means, through diplomacy, through it's not just the again armed means that can get things done. Unfortunately, the past has shown that, like I said, with the Gaza disengagement. But I think at a time when the settlement movement has really been doing things that it's hard to really comprehend on the West Bank in terms of their expansion, their attack on people, the hilltop youth, the closures between villages and cities. Every village now has a gate. And you don't even have a soldier to talk to try and open the gate if an ambulance is trying to get in and out and so on. So at a time when I think the settlement movement thinks that it is advancing and really creating facts on the ground, it is so important that the world is saying, no, actually, as a result of these actions, we are recognizing the Palestinian state along, again, the whole concept of a two-state solution. And the West Bank basically is viewed as occupied territory. So everything that has been done on the ground hasn't led to a situation where the world accepts that this occupation can continue. On the contrary, it's clearly stating, no, this is illegal.
Super. Thank you. Thank you for that. So we have a whole bunch of questions, and I apologize to those who have asked. I don't think we'll get to all of them. I will try my best in this by bundling some of the questions together here, and trying to keep them very directive toward our particular panelists. So Barbara, we have a question from Anne Moisan from the US, which says, does the US want Israel to be the MENA hegemon to take over all security in the region? Does Israel see themselves as the new hegemon and comfortable with taking that security guarantor role from the United States? And I'm going to throw another one in there. I'm not sure it's directly at you, Barbara, but I hope you can give a perspective on it. This comes from Musad Hussein Sada from Iran. And it says, as several Arab states pursue normalization with Israel, how might Iran's opposition to these processes affect Palestinian diplomacy or regional alignments? Also, consider the whisperers of regime change in Iran with Crown Prince Pahlavi developing a relationship with Israel. Is there any conceivable regional order in which Israel, Palestine, and Iran could coexist within a stable framework? Or has the post-October 7th environment made that nearly impossible?
So on the first question, on the question of does the U.S. want Israel to be the new hegemon? I mean, I don't think that question has really been put to the Trump administration, so it's a little hard for me to think whether that would even be remotely the way the president or anybody in his circle would think. I don't think so. There is a felt desire that the region, and in this instance, you start with those 5 Arab countries, that the region take on its responsibilities, and help specifically in the responsibilities for not just reconstructing Gaza, but putting together the security and governance pieces. I don't think hegemon works for anybody. It does not work for any of the Arab states, I can tell you that, and that includes those three states that are arguably closest to Israel: Morocco, UAE, and Bahrain. They do not want a new hegemon. What we strove for in the Biden administration, and only got so far, was, the I word, integration. And integration for a region that is woefully unintegrated from any dimension, economically, politically, and security terms. And that's Arab states not integrated, as well as across the Arab-Israeli divide or the Palestinian-Israeli divide. So I don't think hegemon works for anybody, and because it suggests a role for one country to be determining, especially in kinetic terms, how to settle things. As to that other question on Iran, look, I think I am very much, from long observation of Khamenei's Iran, I don't think the fundamentals of Iran's approach towards Israel, towards the Palestinian cause as a weapon to be used against Israel, I don't think it changes fundamentally until Khamenei passes from the scene. What that next convection of elements of power and elites comes up with is an unknown question at this point. So I'm not a big believer in regime change, period, fostered by outsiders on a given state. I don't, you can change regimes, you cannot necessarily create or influence what comes after. So I think it's mostly a fool's errand. So whether or not I could imagine Iran, Israel, the Palestine, and everybody in a larger security configuration, yes, a very, very different kind of Iran. It's certainly not Khamenei's Iran.
Great, thank you. I think you also answered some questions here about how the regional states can also help support whatever peace plan comes out. So let me turn to you, Shira. There's a number of questions directly for you. I'm going to try to summarize a little bit of what people have written here. But first, from Ahmed from Egypt. From an Israeli standpoint, what could a credible pathway toward de-escalation or negotiation look like? What do Israelis fear most about future scenarios, and what gives them hope? From Tamim Dali from Syria. What new or emerging voices within Israel are calling for alternative approaches? How are civil society, media, and academic circles influencing the national conversation? To what extent are humanitarian considerations part of public or political discussions? So over to you, Shira.
Oh, wow. Hi. So I guess, I'm not bearing any good news. I think in the Israeli public discourse, fears are abundant, and there's less empathy and looking at the others and looking at hope. What are Israelis afraid of? I think they're afraid of pretty much everything at the moment, but October 7 really showed that an adversary like Hamas can do what he did to Israel, and that means that no other front is safe, because, as you may know, but in the Israeli mindset, Hamas was not even a threat. One day, when this is all investigated, I think it will be very clear that Hamas did what it did, but it's really an Israeli failure that enabled the outcome of this attack. I work at RAND. We work a lot on the future of warfare. The fact is, we're talking about many men, but still around 2000s, with Toyotas in flip-flops. And they were able to change the Middle East in ways that none of this AI, hypersonics, and all these things we love talking about, spending so much money on, were able to do. And so Israel sees itself as a country surrounded by enemies and frenemies at the best place, in best scenario. And they're scared that any concession, moving territory, moving out of territory, will be answered with an attempt to attack Israel. As I said before, I think this also hides a fear that Israelis don't trust themselves because of what had happened on October 7, where the Israeli failure basically says that we can't judge the intentions of others, right? I mean, this is why I think it's also when we are looking at the President Trump's effort at the moment, it's very important to listen to what Hamas says. We, Israel, we did not listen to what Hamas said before October 7, right? Yahya Sinwar said prisoners. He said Al-Aqsa Mosque, Haram al-Sharif. We heard pipes for a desalination plant, permits for workers to. It's not what he said. It doesn't mean that Israel should give them. And when they say we will not hand over, we will not give our weapons to a non-Palestinian body, this is something we all have to hear and listen to. So we just know the challenges ahead of us. But I think this is sums up the Israeli fear, and Haitham spoke about it. It's the disengagement from Gaza, that in Israeli mindset, we did everything right in disengagement, everything right. We had Gazans basically be able to develop Singapore, and look what they do. This is the mindset in Israel. It all goes back, and by the way, you asked about the media, an interesting rewrite of the whole narrative of the disengagement. But also Israelis would tell you this time over Lebanon, right? And what you got for years is Hezbollah and other areas. So for Israelis, withdrawing from territories comes with risks. There's the talk now about Sinai as well, which I never thought anyone would talk about peace with Egypt, that maybe we shouldn't have given out the Sinai Peninsula. And therefore, you see not only the IDF will see the extent of the withdrawal from Gaza, but Israel still remains in 5 hilltops in Lebanon, despite an agreement that supposed to be Israel is supposed to leave, and nine spots in Syria, where the threat is different. The other question was there was a question about the humanitarian and media. I think the next elections in Israel, the main conversation, I mean, there's probably, it depending, we don't know, we're in a moment of change and things could be different, but the Israelis are first and foremost focused on domestic issues that have to do with the war. The concept of sharing the burden, the fact that you have so many soldiers who died or continue to serve, people have been in reserve duty for 600 days. When you have a whole sect of the society, the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi Jews, who don't serve at all in the IDF, who most of them do not work, don't contribute to the society and economy, still receive many more services than the other. This is a key issue. You have parties coming, it's called the Reservist Party. This is going to be the sharing the burden is going to be front and center. The conversation about the humanitarian situation in Gaza is very much lacking. When you hear the conversation, it's more of a conversation of look what the world is seeing. We need to know what the world is seeing. It's not because of empathy and understanding the terrible, horrific situation that this war has brought on the Palestinians. Of course, there's on the other, you have the Haaretz newspapers and you have some other voices, but the vast majority of Israelis see this as, well, tough luck, it's Hamas's fault. And the Palestinians voted for Hamas, so that's what you get. And I repeat this point in places because I think people don't realize the echo chamber in which Israelis live. Israelis, for the most part, they watch 3 media channels, mostly 2. There hasn't been a mention of the humanitarian crisis for a long time. There's a report now that was conducted by the Malad Institute. I urge you all to read it. It's 40-page long, but it just by count how many how many opposition leaders were on the media, how many images from Gaza were shown, and you just realize that if this is the mindset in Israel, they just don't see what the rest of the world sees, which I think is tragic because for healing, Israel also have to have awareness of what its actions have led to.
Great, thank you. Shia, I'm going to keep the conversation with you for a second because we had a very, very specific question. This comes from Ali Abdul Wahab from Gaza. He says, Dr. Shira, we're recently seeing some coordination and visible mutual support between the Standing Together movement and young Palestinians in Gaza, especially through social media exchanges that challenge the traditional separation lines. From your perspective, do you see this as a meaningful indicator of future possibilities for shared civic space or coexistence, even if in the very long term?
Hi, Ali. I hope you're okay and that your family's okay. Um, I mean, I think yes, it's hard to talk about this in the current climate. Should be optimistic that even under the current circumstances, these uh, are still remain and grow, and this, under the worst circumstances, right? So they can only grow with time. Those people-to-people engagements, this empathy and seeing the other side. There's, I mean, I know it's a cliche, but the thing about cliches is there's something truth to them, right? They're crazies on both sides that are willing to kill and get killed for the sake of, religion and land. But most people don't want this. Really, and you see it also from the Israelis, and you see it both on the Palestinian side. So I hope so. Unfortunately, the forces that are, um, the what is pulling the pendulum now in Israel is more to the right, more hawkish. It's not about even right left, but right more hawkish voices that choose not to see the other side, and to acknowledge the mistakes and the pain. But this too shall pass, and Israel has shown an ability to self-reflect in the past, and I'm sure it will in the future. And I think, this is Haitham spoke about it also, but I think also for Palestinians who have had two types of leaderships, right, throughout the last few decades, and one that pursued, Haitham said it, the path of violence, and other one, diplomacy. And we can't argue that the path of violence delivered more achievements for the Palestinians. It delivered prisoners, and it delivered some de facto sovereignty over land, and Hamas had control over an international crossing, all these things. And there's a chance there too, right, for reclaiming Palestinian nationalism in ways that the Israelis don't see as threatening to them.
Great, thank
Most
you.
Israelis.
Thank you, Shira. So we're going to come to the portion now. We're going to ask each of you to give some final remarks. And what I'm going to do, though, is combine two questions here, some of which were directed towards an individual, but also I'm going to make it be applicable for all three of you to respond to. So let me take these questions. One is from Mansour Abu Rashid from Jordan. And he particularly points out to you, Shira, that you mentioned the 7 wars that the Israeli army is involved in across the region. I believe that one day political solutions will be found for many of these conflicts. However, in my view, the most complex and long-lasting war is the religious one in Jerusalem, led by various religious groups. How do you see the future of this particular conflict? And I direct that again for all three of you to reflect on. But the last one, I'm going to go back to Doris Awad's question and she poses this from Jerusalem, saying, with broad Arab support for the U.S. plan, what specific leverage can countries in the region apply to both Israelis and Palestinians to ensure that a day after plan does not collapse once implemented? So again, I want to throw these to you both, to all three of you, to reflect on as you think of your final remarks that you want to convey here. So I'm going to go back to you, Barbara, for your thoughts.
So to the first question, I agree that this is this question of division and conflict along religious lines is always, it may be a slightly more remote threat, but once unleashed, and we've seen it happen not just in the Middle East, but in other regions. I think of Bosnia, where I served 8 years after the war, and where the that sort of religious aspect to an ethnic sectarian conflict was really terrible and terrifying. So it's not to be dismissed, and I think, but I don't think it's the most present threat as a match point. Sorry, as an instigation point of conflict. Clearly, the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount is that flashpoint of flashpoints, but I think there are many ways to avoid that, to derail such a conflict long before. As to the what the Arab community, Arab states, and the Palestinians themselves can do to ensure that this plan in post-conflict plan does not get derailed. I go back to the issue of many spoilers, and so how you have to pick them up or fence them off, or and so on. The Arab states, I'm glad to see that this core group of five have gotten themselves aligned in such a way that it really gave uh, velocity, energy to this effort by the administration, because the administration cannot do this alone. We've seen many administrations launch something, it falls flat, nothing goes forward. You do have to have regional ownership of this conflict, which is essentially Israeli-Palestinian. It's not just over Gaza, it's not just over the West Bank. And I don't mean to suggest there is a well fleshed out pathway, time bound and credible, already agreed upon to get to statehood. You've got to do something much more important, and it goes to a point that Shira's touched upon and Haitham, which is normalization starts between Israelis and Palestinians. That's where it is gone, where there are almost no touch points except that very slender security channel that has been resilient, that has worked between the Palestinian Authority and Israeli security and military agencies, but you have to make it bigger than that. The Arab states have to be the champions of a central role for the Palestinian Authority in governance and security. And it's not because the PA is a great, sturdy, democratic, vital machine. It is not. But they will help, they will keep the pressure on it to reform, even as the PA does take its responsibilities. There is a terrible, violent void, anarchy in Gaza now, and something has to come in to take that. Palestinian security forces can begin that work from the get-go. But it will mean pressure is maintained by those Arab states on the PA, on Israel through the US, but also finally, in an affirmative way, those states, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who do not have formal relations, can speak to the Israeli public, and I would hope to see more of that done.
Thank you for that. Hitam, we'll go to you next for your final remarks.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think reading the US plan, the 20 points, I mean, it's the best we could really look at the moment under the circumstances. And there are lots of people who will be thinking in terms of, okay, well, what's this name doing there? What's that name? There's lots of conspiracy theories about what may go wrong. But looking at a document and at specific points, I think at this stage it's good. And we do have a good team of people behind it who both have leverage when it comes to our Palestinian side and on the Israeli side with the US being there. I think one of the mistakes of the past decades is actually one of our ways of showing independence was showing independence even of the Arab states that are around us, which are there to support us and so on. So now, after these past 2 years, it became very important to see even our extension as Palestinians with the surrounding Arab states. And I think that they will have a very important role as not just enablers of this and kind of executioners of the plan, but really guarantors of everyone abiding by it and seeing it going through. And I think there has been, for once, real alignment in terms of benefits for everyone, all the actors in the region, for something to change in the better direction. I think we've seen the horrific results of the approach of the past 2 decades. And I think everyone really welcomes something very different.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And Shira, final remarks?
Yeah. So I'll just, the point about the religious issue and religion being part of it, it's true. It's the conflict was not it wasn't a religious conflict at its basis. Um, but there's no question there's a religious component. And when I spoke about the extreme groups on both sides, even though they're not equal, they're religious motivations, and that therefore there is an importance of how you speak about an agreement, which voices do you bring into the conversation, what can a spiritual leader or a religious leader say in the synagogue or in the mosque, right? Imam in the mosque, when they make concessions and sacrifices. And by the way, these questions will also be relevant, not just for Jerusalem, also for Hamas. Because when I look at organizations like Hamas, and Barbara, you probably remember the Taliban used to say, right, you have the clocks, we have the time, and the same goes for Hamas. This perception, right, this idea of we're not gonna hand over our weapons, or if we do something, it's going to be just a retreat. And how do we speak about this retreat and something that they can accept? And this has to be part of the plan, speaking about something more durable for a long time now. As you know, I think this question about the religious component is really important, and it has to be well thought out in terms of implementation of this plan, because also on the Israeli side, there are issues. And Doris, to your question about the leverage, I mean, keeping at it and persevering is one thing. The second thing is that, we have 2 minutes, but Haitham basically mentions that I think the Arab big rush to be involved and propose a counteroffer was after the math, right? The Riviera idea of Gaza and a voluntary evacuation, and they promised a lot of things. The Arabs, right, as a multinational force and with Arab troops and Arab money, and we're talking about tens of billions of dollars. Are they willing to provide this? And this is a real question. Is Egypt, someone here is from Egypt, right? A country of 120 million people that is concerned about its own stability, going to send its troops to watch the souk, the market in Khan Yunis, to protect Israel? I mean, I just don't see the Egyptians do it. And therefore, it's basically, I think they have the leverage because they can say, well, listen, you want us to do these things, and without our support, none of that's going to happen. There's not going to be a transitional force. There's not going to be training. There's not going to be money. We need to hold the sides accountable for the things that they said. And this basically means telling the US to hold Israel accountable to its own commitments, but also making sure that all others do their part, which includes, of course, Hamas, but also the Palestinian Authority. And, it's not my role to say, but more agency, showing that it's a real alternative government to its people that can effectively govern. The onus is on the PA to also prove its interest and capacity here. But there's a lot the region needs and should do for this to succeed.
Thank you, Shira. I want to thank all the panelists. I think the conversation can go on a lot longer than this, but this is a nice time to have your reflections and your insights from three very, very smart people. So I appreciate your coming together and sharing your thoughts today. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Manny for very brief closing remarks. Manny?
Thank you, Mike, Haitham, Barbara, and Shira. You amazingly well. Now that we have a better understanding of the politics surrounding Israel and Palestine, you won't want to miss part 2 of the series Voices for Peace, where we have the privilege to hear from peace activists about the many ongoing movements led by both Israel and Palestinians. Thank you again, everyone. And thank you, Salome and Emily. And we'll see everyone soon.